Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. On March 8th, we commemorate the International Day of Women, not to celebrate women, but to recognize their struggles for equality and against discrimination and violence. This year, there was a huge march in Mexico City with many young women, a festive and powerful environment. And one of the major demands was to end violence against women, which has been, unfortunately, on the rise here in Mexico. There's one group that has suffered patriarchal violence with little protection and very little resources to fight back, and that's sex workers. Many people have ignored this group in the issue of violence against women, and yet they've organized here in Mexico to improve their situation. The governments and the media pay very little attention. Today, we're talking with Elvira Madrid. Elvira is the president of Brigada Callejera, the Street Brigade, an organization nationwide of sex workers. Elvira, thank you so much for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Thanks for inviting us.
Let's start with the question, what are the specific risks that sex workers face in terms of violence in their daily lives?
Well, there are a lot of risks, but the main ones come from the authorities. There is a lot of abuse from the police, who often make women pay extortion payments to be allowed to work. There is abuse against the clients when they ask for money not to take them into the police station for infractions. There's abuse from the health sector, which requires that they get HIV tests and pay for them. And many times they try to give out condoms, which are paid for by our taxes, and they resell them. There is abuse through a whole series of government institutions that discriminate against women when they are supposed to help us. For example, I've accompanied women to hospitals, and I've seen, not just in cases of HIV or AIDS, that they are in terminal phase, that the hospitals don't want to attend the women. They say, you're here because you're an immoral woman, and we're decent people here. Who are they to say who is decent and who isn't decent? And they have other kinds of diseases, like diabetes, which has been killing a lot of women recently because of problems with stress and diet. The women who work at night get respiratory diseases because they don't wear sweaters, because they have to show themselves off, even when it's cold outside. Or the women who work all day in the heat. I'm talking about 38, 40 degrees Celsius. So yes, there are a lot of issues, a lot of violence.
A lot of people are going to be surprised that you mentioned violence from authorities first. Is this situation the same whether prostitution is legal or prohibited? What's the difference in the conditions for sex workers in zones where it's legalized and zones where it's not?
It's the same. Violence is present whether it's legal or not. In the parts of Mexico City where it's permitted, there is a lot of abuse by the authorities, because in many cases, they are the owners of the establishment or they control the administration of the area. For example, in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, where a lot of abuse is being reported, they charge the customers to just go in. I've never seen a place of sex work in my life where the customers have to pay to get in, you know? And the bathroom, they charge women up to 200 pesos a day for a room where they can practice sex work. They get charged for health services and they get sent to private laboratories where the authorities are often the owners. And it's not cheap. I'm talking about 1,500 to 2,500 pesos. For a pap smear, they've been charged 1,000 pesos. It's exploitation on top of exploitation, and in a place where water is very expensive. And in addition to the room, the women have to pay for the light, the water, when sometimes there isn't even water. So it's abuse after abuse after abuse.
So it's a huge business, and the ones who suffer from it are the sex workers themselves.
Exactly. And the women, like one sex worker said in an institutional work group we're participating in, because everyone washes their hands of it, they say, oh, we didn't know. But this has been going on for so long, so we're sitting down with them so that they'll understand everything that's going on. If you didn't know, listen, find out. She said, look, I don't have the right to get sick, because if I get sick, I have to get money together for my room. If I get sick for 3 days, a week, I still have to pay, you know? Because there is no forgiveness. If you don't go, you still have to pay. So that causes exploitation and abuse of the women. So that's why I say that the authorities are the main abusers. And as long as sex work isn't legalized, the situation won't change. For example, in Mexico City, a human trafficking law was passed in 2017, and it led to the series of human rights violations, where they arrested the people who cleaned and organized the rooms.
As a result of the anti-trafficking law.
Exactly, but they weren't traffickers, and the real traffickers who we denounced, they were released after a week or 3 months because they were able to make the extortion payments. But these women had to stay in jail because, well, they were people from the countryside with no family, without lawyers. Who was going to prove that they weren't traffickers? So they have their statistics that supposedly show they are doing a great job, but we know that isn't true. The human trafficking law changed in 2012, and there was a huge raid in the Merced neighborhood where 95 women were taken away because they were supposedly victims of trafficking.
Yeah, I remember.
And we were able to show with photos and videos that they hadn't taken in any trafficking victims. They just wanted to show that they were doing a great job. We've demonstrated that they tried to pass a 24-year-old woman as a minor. They didn't care what the women said. We had to find her birth certificate and her documents that prove that she was an adult. She had a son, a few months old, and her co-workers had to take turns feeding him and taking care of him. When she was able to get out of a shelter where they had her locked up against her will, they didn't notify her family or anything. She started talking about all of this, and we asked for an injunction. And we were able to get an injunction that recognizes this business as non-wage sex work, a no-wage because it's not salaried because there is no boss. Each person is responsible for her own decisions. That helped a little bit in preventing more human rights violations in Mexico City.
So they recognized people who were sex workers and decided to be sex workers, and who were not victims, who were waiting to be so-called rescued by the authorities. That really changes the image that people have of the anti-trafficking operations, which generally you read the paper and you say, great, you know, they rescued all these poor women who were being held against their will. But you're describing a very different picture.
Exactly. That's why I say, show me the numbers. How many of the supposed traffickers who have been arrested are still in jail? And no, if you check, we did an investigation, and there are very few people who are still in jail for human trafficking. I'll give you an example. We did an investigation on the national level with women who were supposedly victims of trafficking, but who were in jail. So look, they were rescued, but now they're in jail. There was a Honduran woman with 3 children alone in Mexico, in Tapachula. They said they carried out a raid one day and they didn't find any minors or anything. The owner was probably the one who tipped them off, I think, and she escaped. She left the Honduran woman in charge saying, wait for me to come back, you are in charge. She left, and 5 minutes later the raid happened. So they said, unplug that jukebox, count the money. They took photos, and that was their evidence. Fortunately, we had been working there for a while. We already knew the situation, and we knew she wasn't the owner or anything. She was just a waitress. So we filed a lot of complaints to get her out. but we showed it wasn't true. There was another woman, because they raided 3 bars in this way, a woman who was a cook. They said she was a human trafficker. She had a little baby and she had already tried to kill herself. But well, we were able to get them released after 3 months of struggle. So we said that it's a farce, what they do. They need to do real investigations or pay attention to the reports. It's so hard for us, what happens when we report a real pimp? They don't care. They don't even want to open the case. And he's always out of jail in a few days.
For the
Why?
money and the contacts. Yeah.
Yes, because he has money and he can pay the prosecutors and the judges.
So we have a situation where you can't count on the authorities for any protection whatsoever. In fact, the reverse is true in many cases. Tell us about how you organized Brigada Callejera to confront the exploitation and the abuses that sex workers in Mexico were suffering.
It's been very hard for us. Some of us haven't even given their lives after making reports. We've faced assassination attempts. Some of us have been locked up for telling the truth, for talking about what we see. And it's clear to me that as long as this impunity exists, we're not going to be able to achieve very much. We have been able to call the attention of the media to talk about what is happening. Because when we go to the government, they don't want to help us. So we talk to a journalist friend, and they come and help spread the information. As long as we've also been able to get a few people inside of the institutions to really do their jobs well and help us, to support us. And that also helps us to start changing the situation in some places.
Well, when did you start, Elvira?
30 years ago.
30 years.
Yes, it hasn't been easy. Because when we started working the Merced area, which they say is in Latin America, well, it really opened my eyes. Because the sex worker is always portrayed as a femme fatale, who makes a lot of money, who steals husbands, who wears high heels, right?
Mm-hmm. This is a stereotype.
And the reality was something totally different. We found women who are there because they were abused in their homes. That's why I say that the family, not all families are, as they say, good families. There are families that kick out their daughters. There are families who sell them. Some families force their daughters to marry older men, even if they don't want to. And that is still happening today. I just heard from a woman that it's still happening. It's the 21st century. It's 2019. But stuff like that still happens. So unless we change this entire patriarchal system, it's not going to change. We did research. We said that this is a pimp state. And if that doesn't change, we can do a lot of things. But there won't be a real change. So if we aren't able to change this system, it will go on and on and on. And that's why there are so many feminicides, so many rapes, and so many disappeared women. Sometimes I also question some feminist groups. There are different tendencies, and some say no. All victims of disappearances are victims of trafficking. It's not true. Because, well, if you actually have contact and you've done the work, you understand that many of these young women end up in the hands of drug traffickers. First, they rape them, then they kill them. Some of them end up being moved to different places, but really, their modus operandi, if we look at all the reports in the newspapers about these young women, they usually show up dead at the end. And it's the mothers who find them, The authorities don't find anyone. It's like now, the woman who was killed in Tuxtla Gutierrez, the 60-year-old woman, Berta. The way she was killed was so violent.
A sex worker in Tuxtla, a 66-year-old sex worker in Tuxtla just last week.
Yes, a fellow sex worker. She never caused problems. She didn't drink. She didn't smoke. She was a hard worker. She was getting older, and she had very few clients. We were helping her get some economic support because she was having trouble. Her co-workers hired her to take out the trash, wash their clothes, so she could support herself. But it made me angry because some from the tolerance zone saw that she was being abused by several men, called the authorities, called the police, and the police came and drove right by and left.
Oh.
You understand? They could have saved her life. She was raped by all them. And then they customer her, they threw a huge rock at her, destroying her face, and they beat her to death. Like I told the prosecutor, this can't happen. You can arrest them. You think you don't have the evidence? You want me to give you more evidence? I'll give them to you. A patrol car went over there. When it was happening, there's a video from the few cameras that are there. You can say whatever you want, but it is possible to find these killers. But I'll say again, the authorities are deeply involved, and that's why nothing ever happens when we report abuse. Because the police protect the interest of the mayor. The mayor protects the governor. They just pass the blame around. So I always say to them, we're going to speak out about this, because the murder, the femicide of our friend can't go unpunished. Yesterday, our coworkers were still scared, because that area has gotten really violent because of drug trafficking. So if you know what the situation, even further away. So no, we're not animals.
Creating an unsafe situation. It's a system where women's bodies are seen as disposable, and women's lives are seen as completely worthless, or there's no concern. To think that a police car can drive past a scene like that where a woman's being attacked and do nothing. What do you do with a situation like that? How have you been organizing to confront such a huge problem and such a high degree of vulnerability among sex workers?
Fortunately, we're fighting women.
It's obvious.
I think that whenever a coworker gets murdered, gets locked up, gets beaten up for speaking out, it makes us stronger. We've created the Mexican Sex Work Network. We've organized in 27 states. Now, there's going to be a meeting in May. We meet every year to examine the situations we're facing, how we can change them. And we have a 25-year plan, which I think very few other groups have. We're halfway through it. It's all organized, so we can stick to it, and well, that gives us strength. And we don't feel so alone anymore, because we started. You asked what it was like, right?
Yeah.
It was very hard to be able, like, we were trying to send this police officer to jail because he raped one of us. And we couldn't believe it, because we'd worked on it for so many years, but we still couldn't do it. But when we started to get results, people started feeling empowered and started feeling stronger. And yes, we have achieved a lot of things in many different states. It's not required to get tested anymore. Or at least you don't have to pay for health services anymore. We've made it so the police in some places respect sex workers more. We've made it so sex work is recognized, so far in 2 states, and soon in 2 more. We'd like to achieve that in the entire country. So yes, we have organized a lot to defend human rights and labor rights.
Well, it's a tremendous achievement in these conditions, and it means so much, I'm sure, to the members of the organization to, as you say, not feel alone. And we should say the name again of the woman who was murdered, Bertalila Alvaro. We should say their names. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program, and I want to ask you one very important question before we leave. What message can you give the public to break through the stigma of sex workers and create a situation in which there's more support for improving the working and the living conditions of sex workers here in Mexico?
Well, I would tell the public that to improve the conditions of sex workers, their work should be recognized. That creates a guarantee, as they say. And will all exploitation end with that? No. It's like a job, right? A business. You have rights, but labor exploitation still exists, right? And now we see that there are companies that will hire you if you sign your resignation letter. There are companies that don't even respect your rights to social security, to housing. Now, it's by hourly pay.
A lot of them.
They can fire you whenever they want. So it's the same here. Sex workers need to have those same rights that other people already have. When we got the injunction in Mexico City, the judge said something that I liked. She said, the government failed. We didn't give them the right to healthcare, to housing, to education, to a job with fair payment. And whether we like it or not, this is a job, as long as they are adults older than 18. What does that mean? They have the right to form a union. Right now, because of the trafficking law, they can't form a union because they would be accused of human trafficking. Think about that. It creates more discrimination. Every citizen has the right to organize, but not sex workers, because of that law.
Well, we're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. We could go on and on. It's a fascinating subject, and it's fantastic work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being with us, Elvira. And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.